Hi, everybody, and welcome back for another episode of Riftbound 101. This is episode 6, and today we have an in focus coverage episode for Leona, which was one of the legends that I got the most questions about and that I think is super interesting to discuss. And I think it's generally super underrepresented in tournaments, and that means that in general, you can probably build some of the best Leona decks much more cheaply than you can build Kaisa or a Master Yi deck. And I also think that Leona is kind of secretly not so poorly positioned if changes in the meta should arise in the next couple of weeks. So let's get to it. Like the Ari episode, I want to talk about core concepts and key pieces, which I think are always, the most relevant things to discuss when covering a champion. And then the variant discussion is going to be a bit different. When we talked about Ari, there was really an understanding that there's like a core deck Ari and there's a sideboard Ari, and you can kind of swap between the two. That's not the case with Leona. I think Leona has variants, but they are strictly different decks, and I'm going to talk through I think one variant more generally, and then I'm going to position the other one as sort of a counterpoint. And then I'm going to talk to you about a budget version of Leona just broadly, which you can then upgrade into one of the two versions that are sort of popping up here and there. So, core concepts for Leona, like the other heroes that we're going to cover, can really be seen inside of the legend card itself, right? So, Radiant Dawn, when you stun one or more enemy units, you buff a friendly unit. This generally means that the deck will have three key pieces. It will have stuns, it will have units to buff, and it will probably have cards that interact with buffs or that benefit from them. So, if you can if you're trying to think of like what speed this deck will play at, it's actually an interesting question because it certainly won't play as aggressively in the early game as some of the Kaisa or Darius decks, but it won't play for the hyper late game like Aurora decks either. It plays around the 3-4 energy cost curve quite heavily, and not so much on the 2 cost, and not on the 1 either. And this is the main deck curve for what I'm going to call like the main variant of Leona. And the second variant of Leona is quite different in that it will go much higher in terms of mana cost, and it will try to compete with some of the later decks and try to carve out, not quite a control, not quite a mid-range space in that curve that we talked about in episode 1. So Leona decks will tend to be mid-rangey, and you can either speed them up a little bit or slow them down, depending on how you decide to build them. So, in general, that main list runs about 10 sources of stun out of 40 cards. So you're going to see some stun. And I really want to be careful with this because often 3 of those sources of stun will be the champion copy of Leona Determined. And that means that that is a stun on attack. So you actually get a lot more stun from those sources and you want to protect them more heavily. And then you're going to have 10 to 12 payoffs depending on lists. 11 is sort of what I've been seeing. And that's payoffs either for stuns or payoffs for buffs. And then you're going to have a ton of interaction. So stun figures into that somewhat, but you're also going to have cards like Discipline, cards like Defy, and cards like Call to Glory. So a lot of might buffs and some counter spells. And what this allows you to do, depending on the list, is to inherently shift the tempo during the game. So Leona tends to, much like Ari, want to get on point early and stay there. But instead of penalizing your opponent's units, you're going to make your own units stronger. And this means, in general, punishing inefficient attacks with stuns and punishing inefficient spells with buffs. So you get a little bit of both. Your key pieces, I think, are really your stun enablers, and then your pieces of interaction, and then your payoffs. The units themselves are, I think, important, but they vary somewhat depending on lists, and that's a pretty good indicator that what the units want to do is they want to wear the buffs for you to utilize with other spells. And this inherently means that Leona lists will keep changing as people find more suited units into the specific metagame that they're playing in. So I'm going to talk about units a little bit less. The stun package, which is really the core of the deck, is, I think, really complicated to assess because there are a fair amount of cards that say stun on them, and stun as a mechanic kind of needs some additional help, right? So if you're stunning with something like Leona Determined and you put on a buff, Leona will wear it quite nicely at 5 might and 6 on defense. And then you're going to have to find a way to do something with that stun. So you have to either attack units that are on parity or a bit smaller. You want to utilize it to sort of punish spells that would be used more efficiently against you. But stun by itself, much like move in a Yasuo deck by itself, doesn't do as much as hard removal or damage removal. And that's, I think, part of the reason why Leona is represented a little bit less in tournaments. But you'll often run Leona and Solari Shieldbearer, which is the card right behind it, which is a 3 energy, 2 might stun a unit, is also used pretty liberally. 1 or 2 copies of Facebreaker to have a hidden or an action speed stun that will punish attackers, especially big units like Watcher, like Darius Trifarian. In particular, Vi with the Recycle gets hammered by stuns. And then Rune Prison, I think, is just like a decent stun that you'll have to pay a little bit more for, but you get to use it at action speed. And this really means that your stuns kind of fall into one of two situations. You're either using open state stuns, so this is like outside of showdowns, outside of reactions, you are just playing stuns, so something like Solari Shieldbearer. I would even consider Leona Determined to sort of fall into this because you have to engage into an attack, but you can't counterspell abilities, so it forces you to do some stuff, but you're still the proactive player. And then the other half of these are the reactive stuns. So these are the stuns that you get to play when you're being attacked into or to sort of stave off incoming damage. And I think this showcases a bit of the problem that Leona has, which is these spells in general don't draw you cards, and B, they struggle a little bit more against hard removal, well, especially against hard removal, but also into damage removal, depending on what the breakpoints are. So for that, you're going to have some pieces of interaction, and not all of these go in every deck. So Leona has this other problem. Because the bucket of stun cards is so large, you don't get as much space to play, triple on guard, triple discipline, triple defy, and triple zonia. So some lists, the ones that I favor, will have 3 defies and 2 disciplines. Other lists will tend to run 1 on guard and 3 zonias. There are choices to make, and you'll see when we get to the deck lists kind of what they shake out to. My personal preference is to lean on Defy because it helps more against other kinds of damage or other kinds of removal as well. So you can also hit things that are not strictly damage spells like Sabotage or even Charm, for example. And then you have what I would call like your payoffs. And these you will see, I think, really in the sort of main variant. So usually 1 copy of Leona Zealot, which you can actually switch to your champion slot if you like. But I tend to prefer Leona Determined on 4 at all on 4 runes at all costs. So Leona Zealot tends to be used in the late game as a catch-up mechanic and something that you can combine with other stuns to use that -8. So for example, Leona Zealot with like a Solari Shieldbearer or a Rune Prison will really hammer things like White Flame Protector, like Darius, even Thousand-Tailed Watchers on defense, and some variations of Mundo, which you might see if you're playing against Teemo. Herald, I think, fulfills a similar function to Darius Trifarian in red lists, where you're going to be able to sort of play it, stun something, ready it immediately, and then attack. And if you're on a specific battlefield, you can actually stun at another battlefield and ready it again so that it can gank. So this is really sort of like the stun payoffs. And then you're going to have your buff payoffs. So Set will want to see buffs to get bigger, and he's a 5 might unit for 4 energy and 1 order rune. And Fiora, if pushed to 5, will all of a sudden get Deflect, Ganking, and Shield. Deflect specifically very useful into the Fiora into the Kai'Sa matchup, but also now into the Annie matchup or even certain MF matchups. If people are trying to like fight or flight you, for example. One of the other cool things about this package is it tends to run the Poro Herder sort of double Poro setup. So you're going to get like 3 Stalwart Poros and 3 Daring Poros, and then 1 to 3 Poro Herder. I tend to actually prefer 2, but I've seen any variety of the list. The reason why is I think Poro Herder without a Poro is actually like pretty poor. But with is an undercosted for drop that draws you a card, and you can do stuff with the buff afterwards, which is very useful. And Stalwart and Daring Poro are actually very good. Stalwart Poro, if you're on lead, so if you're on 2 runes, is a fantastic unit to get in and defend early. And then Daring Poro actually solves one of the problems that Leona tends to run into, which is it needs more power to take fields, and yellow and green don't always give you the strongest access to units that have high might. The field that I was talking about is Windswept Hillock. So for example, if you ready something like Eclipse Herald and you move it into Windswept Hillock and ready it, then you can gank into the other field and you can really, blow out the opponent's board state. And then outside of this, I think really the main field that's run is Trifarian War Camp. I had a comment on the Ari video, which actually made me think through this. Trifarian War Camp right now is run often in Victor as kind of like a mass offense tool, or in Darius, but it's also very good to make removal less efficient if you dump units into it, and Leona actually wants to hold on it, so that's generally the case. And then there's some variety depending on which list you go to. So Windswept Hillock, Rena's Greatest, and the other one that you tend to see a lot is Vile Maw's Lair. But I've seen Candlelit Sanctum for additional hand fixing, and even things like Grove of the God Willow. I think Navori Fighting Pit is actually kind of a trap here, mostly because unlike the set deck where you can reload on buffs quite liberally, the Leona deck is a bit more sparing with the buffs, and you actually do like them to keep your units either big for defense purposes or for the not-so-hidden secret variant of the deck. And the matchups that arise out of that should be no big surprise to people. Annie, I think now, but Kaisa certainly has been Leona's most unfavored matchup, and I'm sure there are people who are going to tell me that they've seen matchups where somebody can play a Mystic Reversal or a Wind Wall, but to tech the deck against Kaisa, you need a lot of investment, and you're going to have matches that you're going to win. It's not an unwinnable matchup. It's just one where you will struggle to keep units on the board, and if you have trouble keeping units on the board, you're going to have a struggle to stun and to take battlefields, and then also to place buffs on units. So it's a bit complicated. Conversely, I think hyper-aggressive Leona list that just gets on a point and stays there does something very similar to Yi, but has a bit more tricks to out-tempo him. So you're gonna see Leona lists in general succeed a bit more into Aurora lists, especially if they're sideboarding Divine Judgment, which I do in my list, but the list that I'm showcasing will not. Okay, so I've been beating around the bush a lot, and some of you might have asked, well, why isn't Zenith Blade here? Zenith Blade is such a fantastic spell for Leona, and the answer is because there are 2 versions of the deck. The Zenith Blade one, which popped up at CCS over the weekend, I think really highlighted that is like the sort of core version of this deck, and it's really the triple Zenith Blade, which allows you as an action to stun an enemy and move to that enemy's battlefield. This is like a fantastic card with Leona Determine, where you can double stun, Leona Zealot, even things like Set or Fiora, and the Eclipse Herald. So the Eclipse Herald version certainly plays Zenith. The other version, which is very differently built, is the Hook variant. And this is sort of a take on the Darius Hook and the Victor Hook decks, which generally succeed at utilizing Baited Hook to sacrifice recruit tokens that you get from Vanguard Sergeant or from Victor's Leader ability. And in the case of Darius, it lets you tempo out some really big temporary might swings, or play units that in the deck have low might, like Draven, or even cards like Karma or Harness Dragon. Now, in Leona, Baited Hook does something different, which is it utilizes the buffs that you're placing on your units to go get bigger units quite fast. And so it has an easier time, I would say, than the Victor variant and perhaps the Darius variant to really pass that 5 might breakpoint where you can go get really big bombs. But I still think, for example, that this version relies a bit more on surprise and explosive power and the defensive tools of green than the outright aggression of red or the crazy card advantage tools that you find in blue. And the hook variant that I've seen, which really was from I'm pretty sure a Shanghai or Shenzhen city tournament where Leona placed 8 out of I think 78 players, uh, relies on Garen Commander. And so you can hook a 4 might unit like a Puro Herder or a Matron into a Garen, and then you can hook the Garen into a Harness Dragon or a Fey Folk or Yellow Darius, depending on what you do. And the benefit of this deck really is that this is the one version of Hook that can hook Fey Folk and Poro Herder, which other decks just don't get access to, which I think are the strongest things to do. But you can cook up a lot of different stuff with this. And if you're really gung ho, you could even play Commander Ladros in this shell, I think, reasonably, but I would only side it in when I'm against Kaisa, for example. So this means, right, that either version of Leona that you go to, you're going to have to either buy or procure or open or trade a set of 3 Zenith Blades or a set of 3 Baited Hooks, which is not easy in either case. And so what I want to set you up with first is a hyper budget version. And I want to be super clear. This version of the deck will underperform relative to tournament results. This is really a tool for you to get a sense of how the deck plays and what the deck's tempo is. So let's go through it real quick. Leona Determined is your standard champion. You can swap for Leona Zealot, but in general, the crazy play of playing Leona on 2 is really, really strong. I would play her a bit later if you're against a Kaisa deck, or if you're afraid of like 4 cost removal. Otherwise, pushing in with Leona on like turn 3 with open mana to defend is really, really strong, and you get a 5 cost unit with shield on top of it. Triple Defy, 1 Charm, quite stock for many green lists. I'm not playing Discipline in this version. I'm instead playing triple Rune Prison and triple Call to Glory, and my reasoning for that is I would like you to get a sense of how that loop works and just how broken Call to Glory is in decks that can use buffs to just put out any amount of card advantage. But you could, for example, tech out the Vengeance and the Finder Center for 2 Discipline, and it would be fine, I think. You're on the the 3 triple Stalwart Poro Daring Poro Poro Herder package. Again, it's really a teaching tool. And then cards like Facebreaker are really sort of like tech cards for extremely big units. Noxian Drummer, generally a good unit to move around and to wear buffs for your other cards. 1 Solari Shrine, I don't think you want to double draw this under any circumstances, but getting 1 late game when you can stun and kill units will give you some card draw, which is nice. 1 Find Your Center, probably only to play as a cycling card if your opponent's 5 points are up. Triple Solari Shield Bearer, triple Solari Chief, and triple Eclipse Herald. So you're really playing into that mid-range version of the stun package. And then Harness Dragon, I think, is a really, really, really strong card that is being underplayed right now because the shells of yellow that have access to it don't necessarily need it. There are some variants of Hook Darius that will play it, though. So keep that in mind. And I've been experimenting with the yellow-leaning Victor deck as well that likes to play Harness Dragon, and I found it to be fantastic. Surprisingly enough, you would think that you would use this against Master Yi for Aurora, but I've run into a lot of MF Aurora decks where this kind of just gets sniped by a Mind Splitter, and that might happen if you're playing against Yasuo, so don't imagine that you're going to play this often, and I would like hard mulligan it if it's in my opening hand. And then your sideboard is actually like really simple. 3 Spirits Refuge, primarily for Annie and Kaisa. You want more Deflect. This does it for you. 3 Salvage for Aurora and also for opposite hook decks. And you can also use it on Volley's Iron Ballista, which I think really reduces their capacity to pressure you. And then Adaptatron is the same thing. So you have like 3 techs against spell matchups and 5 techs against gear matchups. And I would side them in quite heavily. I would, for example, side in Spirit's Refuge over probably like 1 Harness Dragon, 1 Vengeance, 1 Chief. And then this triple salvage I would use against control triple salvage and Adaptatron against controlling decks. So I might cut like 2 dragon, 1 herald, or some variety of that. And then for the Adaptatron, I would side it over Vengeance and Find Your Center, actually Vengeance and Solari Shrine for sure. And then the battlefields, nothing too complicated. Arena's Greatest to push the game a bit faster. You are still one of the decks that would like the game to end prior to the hyper late games decks getting online. And then Trifarian War Camp and Windswept Hillock we talked about. So this is sort of your shell, right, that you can work with. And playing this deck, I think, like to start with and getting a couple reps on it, will tell you whether or not you want to lean into the Zenith stun reactive game plan, which is a bit more like prey to counterspells, or if you want to play the hook variant. And I have a preference, and I'll tell you why in a second. So the Zenith variant was just piloted by Jared Martinborough at the CCS. I think this list made it to top 50, but I might be mistaken. And it looks a lot like an evolution of the list that I just showed you. So it will cut things like the Harness Dragons and the Solari Chiefs, and it'll instead run Fioras and Sets, and it'll tinker with the spell count in the deck to find a place for On Guard, and especially room for Zonias and Zenith Blades. And so this deck is the closest to the budget version in terms of the deck list. And then the sideboard really plays kind of like a toolbox, right? So 1 to 5 for spell matchups, only 1 salvage, only 1 find your center, Shen again for certain like on the board aggro matchups, 2 Faithful Manufacturer to pressure aggro, 1 Wind Wall, and 1 Vengeance. And so I think this list is equivalent to a lot of the stock lists that you've been seeing either from the Shanghai National or at local events. I think this is sort of like the core version of how people are understanding to play Leona. I personally much prefer the hook variant. And this variant reduces heavily on the number of Leonas that are played in the deck, down to 1. It runs way more Defy, it runs Disciplines, and it will run 1 of Soaring Scout to hook and accelerate your runes. Does not run Seal of Unity, and so it will be a low resource build, and you're playing triple hook, and you're still sort of on the 9 Poro Herder situation, but you're getting Matrons, so you can recur the Poro Herders, and you've got your Solari Chiefs, and then 2 Garen, 3 Fey Folk, and 3 Harness Dragon. The version that I'm personally playing right now, because I don't have access to Tasty Fey Folk, actually runs triple Yellow Darius, and I have found it to be really beefy and to trade reasonably favorably into things like Falling Star and a variety of smaller ping spells. And it has the same sideboard as the stock version that I was recommending for budget. Triple Spirits, triple Salvage, and double Adaptatron. And the situation with the battlefields is quite different. Because this doesn't use Zenith Blade and it doesn't use Eclipse Herald, you're not on Windswept Hillock, you're instead on Vilemaw's Lair to prevent opponents from getting out. You're reasonably sure that you can trade with them and you want to like engage fights. This works kind of like the opposite of Reaver's Row. So this will be a very difficult matchup, for example, for red battlefield for red decks to commit into and then get back out of. You can't retreat, and so this really punishes Conqueror strats more strongly. And then Candlelit Sanctum I find to be necessary to help with draw, which I still think is this color pair's primary weakness currently. And so you can, it was the Shenzhen. Man, I said Shanghai first, but Shenzhen second. Okay. Um, and this really is interesting to me because the budget version that I'm recommending is about $20 US. It is dirt cheap to get into this deck, and you can test it out. It might feel weak, but you can definitely decide which version you'd like. And the Hook and the Zenith Blade version are about like $8 apart. But what I think is super important is that the Hook version will allow you to side grade into Hook Darius, Hook Victor. I, there's no like Hook Garen or Hook set that are currently running around. And I think Hook is one of those cards that will continue to gain value as time goes on, especially seeing as there are a ton of graveyard based units that don't see play currently, like Karthus and Machine Herald. It does, but only as like a two of. And so it's reasonable to imagine that there will be a purple yellow champion at some point that will allow you to play Hook along with the graveyard reanimation stuff in purple. And I'm kind of just happy holding on to these cards for that and then swapping around week to week between Leona, Darius, and Victor for myself. So I personally would recommend the Hook variant. I also cannot seem to find Zenith Blades for the life of me. So that might just be a Montreal problem. So it depends what you open. If you open like two Zenith Blades, get a third one, and you're going to be happy. But I tend to favor decks that will let me invest my money into game pieces that are translatable between decks. See me about set prices in like a week or two. So really, what I would like to end on this is the main attraction for Leona. I think it's quite clear that in like 100+ cut of people, you'll see maybe one or two Leona players. And I think Leona gets you sort of like the popularity discount because of that. Because she's not played and because a lot of the yellow units that are favored in her are not seeing a lot of play, you can build one of these decks for about a quarter of what an Ari deck costs and much less than what a Kaisa or Set or uh, Aurora or Deadbloom deck costs right now. And so you can reasonably start training on this well. And you're almost always going to benefit from the fact that this is one of the matchups that people just do not see and don't have a lot of reps in. And so you can surprise some people for sure. The plan for next Monday will be to talk about the meta and especially shifts in the meta and how you can see that metas are localized between, for example, China and NA. And we're going to talk about some implications of what that has for like deck choices and how you should play and how you should build. So that's the main plan. And then I'm reasonably sure next Wednesday is going to be the in focus on Darius. So see you next Monday and then Wednesday. And I hope you like this. And if you're a Leona player and you're not on either of these lists, let me know because maybe there is some spicy tech to have. And I'm curious to see if people are going to find margins on her now that the meta is shifting a little bit. Have a nice one. I'll see you soon.